All right, well, welcome back. We are here again for Mark chapter 15, our next to last week in our series through this year of being in the Gospel of Mark. And today we're going to look at a quick overview of all of chapter 15. And then I want to drill down on verses 33 to 41, which depicts the death of Jesus. Um, so we're talking about atonement. We're going to talk about um, the what Jesus' death means for us, and all the circumstances surrounding his crucifixion. So buckle up. We got a lot to cover, and I hope this is helpful for you as you are leading your groups this week. So, all right. So when we left off in chapter 14, the last scene in chapter 14 is when Peter denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crows twice, and Peter weeps bitterly. He breaks down and weeps, and because he remembered the words of Jesus. So he's going to reappear in just a little bit. But what happens next is that Jesus goes before Pilate. And Pilate is the Roman governor of the region. So remember, cockcrow is between 3 and or noon and or midnight and 3 a.m. And so it's just as the sun is beginning to appear on the horizon, so that the rooster sees the sunlight, and the light begins to fill the sky. So the rooster crows because it sees the light, and so that's what's happening as Peter is denying Jesus. So as soon as it was morning, so sometime after 3 o'clock in the morning, between 3 and 6, which is dawn, there would be the light would fill the sky, and so as soon as it was morning, verse 1 says, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council. So they go to the Sanhedrin, and they figure out, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to hand him over to Pilate. So they bind Jesus, they lead him away, and they hand him over to Pilate. And Pilate begins to question Jesus. He says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answers him, "You say so." And so basically, he's agreeing with him in a way that is telling Pilate that he has stated clearly who Jesus really is. So then the chief priests accuse him of many things, and they bring many charges against him, and Jesus doesn't speak out against them. And Pilate again asks Jesus, "Have you no answer? See how many charges they bring against you?" But Jesus makes no further reply, Mark tells us. And Pilate was amazed. He was filled with awe and wonder in this moment. And then we learn a little bit of history that there is a custom around the festival of Passover that the Romans will release one prisoner of the Jews' choosing at this time, and they will be pardoned and set free. And so Pilate asks, "Do you want me to release to you Barabbas?" And then Mark gives us some history about Barabbas being an insurrectionist, and he committed murder. And now, and he says, "Or do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" And so, and then verse 10 is a parenthetical statement that Mark gives us about Pilate, where he says, for Pilate realized that it was out of jealousy that the chief priests handed him over. But then, remember those crowds that are there for Passover? Now their presence is going to be in the favor of the chief priests and the elders and the scribes, because in a way that they couldn't utilize, they couldn't get Jesus off by himself because of all the crowds. Now they used the presence of the crowds on this day of Passover um, to stir up the rebellion against Jesus. So, verse 11, the chief priests stirred up the crowds to have them release Barabbas instead of Jesus. And then Pilate asks, "Well, what do you want me to do with this King of the Jews?" And they begin to shout out those infamous words, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And Pilate asks again. Pilate is good at asking questions here. He says, "Why? What evil? Um, what evil has he done?" But they shout all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate, who has very little backbone in this moment, wishes to satisfy the crowd, and so he hands over Jesus, uh, or he releases Barabbas, and then sends Jesus for a flogging, then hands him over to the soldiers to be crucified. So now that this portion of Jesus's trial has effectively ended. The Jewish law prevented the Jews from executing someone, giving them capital punishment, but the Roman law said that they could. And so when the Jewish the council, the Sanhedrin, and the chief priests said, "Okay, we know that you are." They think that Jesus is blasphemous, but Pilate isn't going to care about blasphemy. He doesn't care about Jewish customs and religion. He cares about rule and order in the empire. And so Jesus is accused of blasphemy. They convict him of that in the Sanhedrin. They take him to Pilate, but they call him the King of the Jews. They use a phrase that would have riled up Pilate, wondering, is this someone that's going to challenge Caesar? And because Caesar's the king, and so if they call him the King of the Jews, then he becomes a someone who is opposed to Caesar. Now, they should have already known this, because Jesus has been a problem in Caesar's side up until this point already. But now they're making it clear that Jesus is a threat to Caesar, and so they have to kill him. And they work it so that Barabbas gets released and Jesus gets sent to be crucified. So the soldiers take him into the courtyard, the praetorium, the governor's headquarters, and they all gather around him, and they put a purple cloak on him. They twist thorns, they weave these thorns together, they make a crown, and they put it on his head, and they start to beat him, and they mock him. They begin to salute him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They strike his head with a reed, they spit on him, they falsely kneel and pay him homage. And then when they're done, they take off the purple cloak, they put his clothes back on, and they lead him out to crucify him. And crucifixion is the most painful way to die that the Romans could think of, and they were masters of it in the first century. This is now we're in verse 21 in chapter 15, and they compel Simon of Cyrene to come and carry Jesus's cross. Most likely, he carried the cross piece that would have been across his shoulders, big heavy wooden beam. And we get its note that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus, and there's a link in to Romans 16 where those names show up again as followers of Christ. So it's a nice little turnaround. And remember, Mark is written to Christians in Rome. So when Paul writes to the church in Rome, he references Alexander and Rufus. Let me go there real quick and just double check. So in not too far. In Romans 16, there's a list of those who are there, and so in Romans 16:13, Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and greet his mother, a mother to me also." So Rufus gets mentioned again, not only here in Mark, but then also in Romans chapter 16. So perhaps as Mark is writing to this Roman Gentile Christian audience, and that this gospel is being shared, then when Paul writes to the Romans, then there's this crossover. There's this connection between Mark's gospel, which is Mark's is trying to capture Peter's story of how Jesus interacted with the world, and now Paul is writing to the church in Rome that he never got to visit, but there's this connection between the Simon of Cyrene, who is the father of Rufus and Alexander, and this Rufus being referred to in the life of Paul as someone who was very supportive of him. So really cool little connection there. All right. So too far here. So Simon of Cyrene is compelled to carry the cross. They bring Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. It's just outside of the city limits of Jerusalem. And they offer Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, but he does not take it. And so then they crucify him, which means they take that cross piece that is across his shoulders and they attach it to a vertical wooden beam, and then they hoist him up into the air, and the vertical beam then slips down into a slot in the ground, so that everything is solid, and the cross will bear Jesus' weight, and it won't fall over. He'll hang there, and that's when the asphyxiation starts, because the way that Jesus is hung on the cross is that everything, gravity is working against him, and then it's pushing down on his internal organs, and he has this little step at his feet, and it's excruciating to push up his body to catch his breath, and as the pressure mounts, he takes shallower and shallower breaths. It's just awful. So they offer him wine mixed with myrrh. He doesn't take it. And then they divide his clothes. Verse 24, they divide his clothes among them, casting lots to decide what each should take. And then there's a reference to, let's see. There's a reference to Psalm 22:18, where clothes are divided and casting lots. So verse 25, it was 9 o'clock in the morning. So morning is between 3 and 6. So at 9 o'clock is when they crucify him. So we have time markers here. And so then we get the inscription of the charge that's against him. So the reason he's being crucified is that he is the King of the Jews. And there's one bandit on his left and one bandit on his right. This is the Lestos, which are these robbers, these brigands. They're the same kind of people that Barabbas was. And the people who are passing by are mocking him. They're deriding him, or even could be translated as blaspheming him. And they're shaking their heads at him, saying, "Ah, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." And then the chief priests and the scribes, they're mocking him as well, saying, "He saved others, but he cannot save himself." Then they go on to say, "Let the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." And even then, those who were crucified with him, the one on the left and the one on the right, mock him and taunt him. So that's the setup for the scene of his death. That's his crucifixion scene, and then here, then we come to the death scene. So now, verse 33 says, it was about noon. So they put him on the cross and they crucified him at 9 o'clock in the morning. So 3 hours later, at noon, darkness comes over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. So again, these time moments are important. Early morning, 6 o'clock, he's tried in front of Pilate. 9 o'clock, he's crucified, he's put on the cross and hoisted up into the air. At noon, there's darkness that comes over the whole land for 3 more hours until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And verse 34 says, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he cries out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is Aramaic. And Mark translates it for us as, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is a direct quote from Psalm 22. And it would have Psalm 22, verse 1. And those who were Jewish would have known the Psalter, and they would have known exactly what he was saying, and they should have known exactly what he was saying, and they would have been able to keep going with that psalm. And if they get to the end, they would get to the one who is crucified. They would get to the one whose clothes are divided. So I'm just going to journey us back to Psalm 22 real quick. So in my Bible, the Psalm 22 is headlined by a plea for deliverance from suffering and hostility. It's 31 verses long, but watch what the psalmist does. This is from David. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Hear it? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Watch this. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Keep reading. Watch what happens. But I am a worm and not human. Remember, this is David speaking. Scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock at me. They make mouths at me. They shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar to what the people said? Let the chief priests and let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now so that we may see and believe. Oh, you who destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross. It's no wonder he quotes Psalm 22. It's no wonder that Jesus cries out in this moment, because he does feel forsaken. He feels abandoned. That's another way to translate that. Forsaken is abandonment. He feels all alone in this moment. But there's misunderstanding about what he's saying. Verse 35 says, when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, which is it's like vinegar. It's a cheap anesthesia that the Roman soldiers would have used. So most likely the misunderstanding is one of the Roman guards that would be around at the foot of the cross. And so they go and they get some sour wine, they put it on a sponge, and they put it on a stick and they give it to him. And they say, let's see if Elijah comes and takes him down off the cross. Will Elijah come, take him down? Then verse 37, Jesus gives a loud cry and breathed his last. Now, he's cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And now, at some level, he has hoisted himself up just enough to make another loud cry, and he breathes his last. He takes it. For me, him um, expressing a loud cry and breathing his last means that he was conscious as he died. And so he exhales everything that he has and dies. And then verse 38 says, "And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom." Verse 39, "Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, 'Truly this man was God's son.'" So for my message on Sunday, I'm going to focus on verses 37, 38, and 39, because I feel like these three verses tie back to so many different places in Mark's gospel. We have to stop and pause, and we have to unpack these. What's the meaning here? What's going on here? And so let's take a little look. We'll take a look in just a minute. So verse 40 and 41 is recalling of the women that were nearby. They're looking on from a distance: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. They followed him. Mark's telling us that they used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. And then chapter 15 closes with the burial of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea comes. He's a respected member of the Sanhedrin that had just convicted Jesus of blasphemy and handed him over to Pilate. But Joseph of Arimathea is a follower of Christ, and he stands out. And in John's gospel, he, along with Nicodemus, get together in this moment. So because it was, verse 42 says, "Since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus." Now, Pilate could release these crucified people's bodies to somebody if they wished. If somebody wanted to claim them, it was his right to do that. And so Pilate didn't know if Jesus was dead, because it'd only been 3 hours since he'd been hoisted up onto that this cross had been made vertical. And typically, crucifixions take a while because you suffocate to death. And that just, for some people, it just takes an incredible amount of time. And so Pilate wondered if he was already dead, and he summons the centurion from verse 39. And the centurion says, "Yeah, he's dead." So he grants the body to Joseph. And Joseph brings a linen cloth, and he takes the body and wraps it down in the cloth, and he lays it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And then verse 47 says that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. This is important for chapter 16, but that's for next week. So we have the crucifixion, we have the trial before Pilate, we have the crucifixion, the death, and the burial of Jesus in chapter 15. There's a lot here, but I'm going to go back to verses 37, 38, and 39, and talk and unpack those just a little bit. So verse 37 says, "Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last." This loud cry was most likely a cry of anguish, a cry of desperation, a cry of probably utter pain, given everything that his body was going through, as he is slowly no longer being able to breathe the way that he normally does, as his lungs are pushed down by the rest of his organs because of the position of his body and the fact that he cannot straighten up without excruciating pain, thanks to the beatings and the whippings, um, and the fact that his hands are secured to the crossbeam and his feet are secured to the vertical beam. So he has really no way to relieve the pain, or the breathing pressure, pressure on his lungs, without excruciating pain being added on top of that. This is why the Romans chose crucifixion as a way to execute um, uh, people for capital crimes. It's because it was incredibly painful. It was incredibly long, and it just inflicted the most amount of pain that they could possibly do, and it was just pure torture. So he breathes, he lets out this loud cry. We don't have, it was probably just, it may have just been a scream of pain. There's some that want to, connect the my God, why have you forsaken me, to this loud cry, and connect these two moments together. Or there's some scholars that want to make them two different ones. The thing is that Mark tells us there's the my God, why have you forsaken me? And then there's this loud cry. And so, whether it's the same one and it's a continuation, or there's an interruption there with the misunderstanding about what Jesus is saying, and then just picking it back up, or if there's two separate cries. Either way, Mark doesn't tell us what this second cry in verse 37 is, if it's words or if it's just a scream of pain or whatever. But he does say that he breathes his last. So in this moment, he exhales everything that he has left in his body. And he gives up his spirit, I believe, as Mark, or as Luke says. And breath and spirit and wind are all the same word in Hebrew and in Greek. So there's a connection there. All right. Verse 38 is not a throwaway verse. It's not a throwaway line. It's not just like extra little information about stuff. Verse 38 is incredibly important to what Jesus's death means for us as his followers, in what his death accomplishes in the world. I'll read it again. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now the curtain that's in the temple is in between the most holy place and the holy place. So if you think about the structure of the temple, there's the Temple Mount, which is the largest area, which is the court of the Gentiles, is the largest space. Inside that is the court of the women. You have to go through the beautiful gate to get there. Inside that is the court of the priests. And then that's all open air. And then finally, under roof is the holy place, which is where the bread of the presence is. It's where the lampstand is, and so then there is the curtain. The curtain separates the holy place from the most holy place, or from the Holy of Holies, which is where the Ark of the Covenant is, which is where the Jews believed that the presence of God dwelt. And the only person who could go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest, and he could only go on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. He could go on the Day of Atonement, but he had to go in with a rope tied around his ankle, and he had bells on the bottom of his robe, so that as he was making the offering for atonement, that the people would hear him, the priests outside would hear him moving around. And then, but if he died in the midst of his priestly duties there in the Holy of Holies, and they heard the bells stop for a significant period of time, they could use the rope to pull him out because they weren't allowed to go in. Only the high priest was allowed to go in. And so the curtain separated the presence of God from everybody else. And Mark tells us that the curtain in the temple was torn in two. And notice the direction that the curtain is torn in. It's torn from top to bottom. The word top can also be understood as from the high places, from the high heaven and down. Notice that the temple curtain is torn from the top to the bottom. There wasn't anybody sitting there in the holy place, ready, at the ready, with a sword or a knife or something like that, waiting for Jesus to die so that they could rip the curtain from the bottom to the top, because the curtain is like 20 feet tall. So there's no way that a human being ripped this curtain or tore this curtain. This was God ripping the curtain, tearing the curtain from top to bottom. And what we understand is happening in this moment is that there is now no more separation between the presence of God and the people of God. The veil has been torn. It's forever rendered open. So through the death of Jesus, there is no mediator other than Jesus to get to the Lord. And Jesus is already gone. So we're right there. There's no dividing line. There's no division that's left. It's been torn asunder. So we as followers of Christ have direct access to God. We don't have to go through a mediator. We don't have to go through sacrifices. Our sacrifice has been made. The Paschal Lamb, the Lamb who was slain, Jesus, has died so that we might have access to God. It's an amazing image there. Now, verse 39 is really remarkable here. Verse 39 gives us the words of a Roman thug charged with making sure that nobody came close enough to Jesus to try to take him down off the cross. He was probably part of the group that beat him and mocked him and bowed down in mock worship of him and twisted the crown of thorns on his head, put the purple cloak on him earlier in the chapter. This Roman centurion, a man in charge of about 100 soldiers, sees what has happened. Who stood facing him. He saw that in this way, he breathed his last. And the Roman centurion says, truly, this man was God's son. The very first person who was not possessed by a demon in the Gospel of Mark to identify Jesus as the Son of God is this Roman centurion, this guy who was familiar with death and destruction and violence and hatred. Is the one who proclaims that Jesus is God's son because he's witnessed his death on the cross. This would have been incredibly encouraging to the Roman audience that Mark is writing to. It should be incredibly encouraging to us, just as Gentiles, just as people who don't have a particular Jewish heritage. It should be particularly encouraging to those of us who stand in need of forgiveness. Maybe not for violent acts, maybe not for totally turning our back on God, but for the things that separate us from God. Because in the death of Christ, the curtain has been torn in two, and God is there and available for us to come to and run to and 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 lay ourselves out in front of him, knowing that he will be there, knowing that he has restored that relationship through Christ. Truly, this man was God's son. Out of the mouth of a Roman centurion, a soldier acquainted with death and destruction, comes good news of Jesus Christ. A lot today, a lot for Sunday. My prayer for you is that as you lead your groups this week, that you will find a sense of hope, a sense of peace and love and grace and forgiveness found in the death of Jesus. Yes, it is a brutal scene. There's no getting around that. But out of the death of Christ comes the forgiveness of our sins and the restoration of the relationship that was broken by that sin. So I pray that as you lead your groups, that the Spirit is present there with and among you, and that if you have any questions, if you have need of resources or anything like that, that you reach out and let me know, and I'll see what I can do for you. I'd be happy to help however I can. Thank you so much for the ways in which you lead our small groups and our Sunday school classes, and for the ways in which you help disciple our congregation. Till we see each other again, blessings to you today and always.